Well, hello again. Well, a lot of what we've been hearing about today, whether you've been watching the great talks in this track or other ones, is about doing things differently and trying out new things, changing, if you will. And I found over the years that one of the things that you really need that's too often neglected is metrics or measurements, especially when you're changing to make sure things are working out well. And if they're not, that you can try something different. But that's why I'm looking forward to the next talk, which is going to go a little bit over, I don't know, let's call it the power of metrics and new ways of thinking about it to improve things. So let's check it out.
Thanks for that intro. My name's Danny Wittenberg. I have been at VMware and before that Pivotal for about 5 years, working in all things PM, agile leadership engagement, as well as some classic PM work with a variety of teams. And right now I'm working in our public sector division on some exciting projects. And I'm applying some of the very things we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to bump over now to Krista so she can introduce herself and get us rolling.
Thank you. So my name is Krista Luna. I'm a product manager with VMware, where I get the opportunity to help our clients build, run, and manage their most important applications. Our passion in crafting successful teams and programs is really what led us to this topic. How using metrics, you can tell the story of your teams, how they're doing, and how they can be optimized. No matter your role, studio lead, a practice lead, or a practice coach, if you're in charge of growing the discipline around you, we have ways to help boost your efficiency. Or perhaps you're a business owner that's looking for a common language of success to forecast what your program needs. Or maybe you don't fit into either of these categories and you're just interested in learning how, with metrics, you can shape productive teams at scale. This talk will give you the tools to measure your program's health and the knowledge of when those teams might need more attention or if they're healthy and able to continue on uninterrupted. First, we're defining a program as any collection of teams helping the organization move in a certain direction. You can also call them portfolios, labs, or studios. Next is program health. We're taking a look at the collective ability for these teams to meet outcomes and deliver value. What you will see from healthy programs are teams that produce high realized value with relatively low operation overhead. Traits in these healthy teams are that they're autonomous, value seeking, and show high levels of self awareness and discipline, plus, they understand how to measure themselves. When a team is healthy, they are able to reflect and self correct, requiring less involvement from outside the team. That need from help outside the team is a common challenge we've seen, especially from our large enterprise level clients. How to scale these programs without needing to scale the human capital investment in managing the growth. There are many reasons why scaling the practice coaches as rapidly as the teams themselves isn't always an option. Not every organization has the salary or hiring ability to support that. While there could be a willingness to invest in large-scale practice leadership, finding that many practice coaches is often impractical or impossible. Other times, the willingness at that leadership level to sponsor those practice coaches isn't there. Even if you're not trying to scale rapidly, this approach can be effectively leveraged in smaller organizations and still be a win at any scale. Measuring quantitative indicators will tell the story of each of your teams so that you can spend less time on healthy teams, focus in specifically on the teams that need attention, and broadcast the condition of the programs in a common language. We are looking at positive behavior changes that will increase long-term team productivity and not just a short-term velocity bump. I want to talk about the benefits of this quantitative approach. We've touched on the area of slowing the need for practice management scaling at the same rate as increasing teams. Another benefit is tracking team progress of their agile maturity. As teams mature, their efficiency and reliability metrics increase and their volatility remains low. These metrics can then be used as a great communication tools for program managers who are looking to forecast deliverables. Program coaches need a language to speak to people outside of their teams who might not understand specific team effectiveness terminology. Because this approach is quantitative, our model provides a benchmarkable set of terms that leaders can use to communicate program effectiveness and health to those who are not in day-to-day contact with the team. Now with these metrics, practice coaches have a common language to explain what teams need to become more optimized and generate more value per cycle, and how they can shape decisions around when a highly tuned and well-functioning lab might need more personnel to attain a higher output. Management by exception is a wonderful way to set team standards and allow the teams to manage themselves. You can reduce a significant percentage of your available leadership time budget on identified and high impact program problems when you know which areas are already running efficiently. We can then stay out of the way of a team that's running well. As we optimize teams, the program health overall goes up, leading to fewer exceptions. The same number of practice leads can then handle more and more teams as they require fewer and fewer intervention. This problem solving can happen when a lab has already grown with some problems or it's small and growing rapidly. Instead of needing a surge of practice coaches, problem solving in these programs becomes a sustainable practice. There are other great metrics to track, so we are not advocating for replacing any of these three. Door metrics are awesome. However, that measurement alone doesn't get at team behavior. Our approach examines a level of granularity below door metrics. And team health checks are extremely valuable for teams who aren't healthy or performing, but they can be expensive, time consuming, and not needed as often for healthy teams. OKRs, KPIs, or jobs to be done is a great way for teams to track their goals. Our measurements can then be used to inform the likelihood of achieving these goals. And now that I've set the stage for understanding our approach, Daniel's going to actually talk about doing it.
Thanks, Trista, for those remarks on the value of measuring a program of teams. Now we're going to talk about what metrics we find most impactful and how we arrange them into a consumable dashboard that people across both the business and any team or teams can use effectively. First, let's talk a bit about measurement itself. To be useful, program metrics are just like the metrics we teach to our PMs over in, what was once Pivotal. I sometimes forget that we're now VMware. And we also use for looking at the products we create. What we want are the 3 A's: actionable, accessible, and auditable metrics. Actionable metrics tell us something that we have about things we have the ability to affect. What that means in practice is that we are looking at things inside of our program that we can change by taking action ourselves. Obviously, research can be fun to do on things that we can't change, but in this case, we definitely want things that we can affect. Accessible means that anybody can understand the value of measuring this metric, which is to say you don't need an advanced degree or read a textbook to understand why we're measuring it and why it tells us something valuable. And auditable means that people can credibly connect the metric to the thing that it's supposed to measure, which is to say, you really believe that when you make this measurement, you're learning about the thing that you think you're measuring. In the same sort of way that if you hear about temperature, that the weather's going to be outside, you know that that is actually describing something about the weather, and you'll have a certain kind of experience when you go out. We like to use something simple to actually think about our measurements, and there's several reasons for this. The first one is that for people, it is just easier to understand when there aren't too many gradations in a measurement. And if we need to dive deeper, we can. It's also a visual indicator when we use red, amber, green. And that's helpful because when we create dashboards, it means that we can pretty much just glance at them and immediately see if something has changed from before. There's other ways you can do this, but we like to use the RAG system because people understand it. It's actually a metaphor for something in the real world, i.e. traffic lights, and it's consistent. If we use it again and again, people know what to expect when they see it. So which are the core metrics that inform us about the health of a program of teams and are most impactful when thinking about getting to that actionability? First thing I want to say about this is that we shouldn't flood the zone. We don't want to have too many measurements in the same sense that we don't want to have too many gradations on our metric. If you have too many things that you measure, people kind of get flooded and lost, and sometimes it's actually more difficult to understand what to do next. So we want to just pick out a few that are really going to tell us a lot about our program and help us make change. First thing we'll talk about before we dive into the specifics here are what are the kind of categories that we think about. As you can see, I've got an example of a dashboard here. It's got a few different things on it, and we're talking about a category of efficiency and reliability. Efficiency is really about understanding your return on investment. What we want to see here is teams providing a lot of new value and not doing a lot of work that doesn't actually contribute to the things that they're building. So we want them completing stories and not working on a lot of bugs and chores. At the same time, we want to think about reliability, which is how well we can think about what teams will be able to do in the future. That is to say, how precise can we be about forecasting what the program will be able to deliver in the future when comparing the activities that they've done in the past. So the more reliable they are, the more we can look into the future and say we have a high degree of precision about what we can forecast that the program will be able to generate in value. When we put these two things together, we can talk about the program being fully optimized. So in that respect, you're getting as much as you can out of the program at the same time as feeling confident that you can tell the business about how things on their roadmap will likely be delivered in the future. Let's go back to that first category, efficiency. As we mentioned, these are the metrics that tell us about how things are going right now and how much the team is expending effort on creating new value versus doing things that are potentially good for the team or fixing things that were broken, but aren't actually about generating something new. The first thing that we look at, and maybe the most important metric in this category, is the percentage of accepted stories that were defect corrections versus the ones that were new value. So what we really want to look for here is a team that is doing about 90% of its work on new value versus spending about, let's say, 10% of its time fixing things that were broken, or hopefully even less than that. The reason we look at this one over an aggregate of all the possible things that they could be doing that are not new value generation is that bug fixing or fixing defects in stories that weren't delivered correctly is actually more egregious than, say, doing a spike or maintaining a pipeline, because not only are you fixing something that's broken and therefore not doing something new, but you're actually adding to the burden of what it took to deliver that first story in the first place. So it's kind of a double hit. Of course, you could look at those other things, but because we are looking to not have too many indicators, this is the one that I usually want to go to first. So here, if they're delivering below 90% new value, then it's probably time to go in and take a look at either what the whole program is doing, or if it seems to be an individual team that's struggling and bringing down the program numbers, take a look at what's going on there. The other metric that we want to look at in the efficiency category is mean time and delivery state in days, which sounds like a mouthful, but it's really just a segment of the cycle time of the story. So if cycle time is is the time that elapses between when an engineer or an engineer pair pick up a story for the first time, and then the time that they actually deliver it and it's ready for going into production. So between that time, or I should say between those two times, there's several different segments of activity that happen to the story. First, the engineers work on it, then they run the acceptance test themselves to make sure they've done it correctly, and then they pass it along to either the PM or maybe a Scrum Master or a QA person to make sure that the story is bug-free and actually delivered the way it was supposed to be. So that's the period we're talking about here. And why this is important is it speaks to the flow of stories through the team, but it also speaks to how the team interacts with itself. And when the flow is going well, and these are being checked as soon as the engineers are finished with them, we know that everybody is checking in with each other on a very regular basis, and the balanced team is working as well as possible. Furthermore, we don't get into situations where a story gets delivered, nobody looks at it for a while, then that engineer pair picks up a new story and maybe another new story, and they go off and they build a few things, and they might have been naturally dependent on that first story. And what can happen is you can end up with somebody eventually taking a look, realizing there's a bug or something wrong with the way that it was delivered in terms of how the story was described. And then all those other stories end up having to be worked on again. And that creates a lot of turbulence in the team and lowers their productivity. Another thing that sometimes happens is that people habitually leave this to the end of an iteration, and then something like what I first described happens, and they end up with a velocity that's very low or even zero because all of those things fail and there's no time to go back and correct them. So even though the team was very close to doing a lot of good work in that iteration, it doesn't show up in their statistics, and therefore we don't have the ability to actually see what they're really doing because of the way that we break up our iterations and where the work is happening, it becomes invisible. So in order for the team to understand what they're doing, they should be checking in with each other very regularly and making sure that those stories are being picked up and checked in a timely fashion. Typically, when I'm looking at teams, I like to see that no more than 2 days is going by before somebody checks it, but ideally it should happen even more quickly than that. Let's look at that other statistical category, reliability. We have one main metric here that we believe is the one that indicates the most about whether or not a team or a program of teams is going to be reliable and therefore give us a lot of precision in being able to forecast what might happen in the future. And that statistic is volatility. Why this metric is important is because what it's measuring is how different a team's velocity is from iteration to iteration. And unlike velocity, it's something that you can actually aggregate across teams and compare them to each other, because irrespective of how they measure their velocity internally and what scale they use, volatility, which is a measure of change, is pretty much exactly the same across teams. If you measure it in one team one way and in another team the exact same way, you can compare them. And if you can compare them, you can aggregate them and get a mean. So the mean volatility for the whole program tells you on average how reliable your entire program is going to be, and therefore how much you are able to rely on historical data to tell you about what might happen in the future. So if you want to visualize a forecast, you might draw a diagram something like this one. A low volatility program isn't going to have a lot of difference between, let's say, a best case scenario and a worst case scenario when you think about the uncertainty value or the difference between those two things when you're looking out into the future, which means that you can look further afield, maybe even a quarter or two into the future, and say that the level of precision you have in your forecast is such that you're not really guessing. If these things become too wide, then you are sort of getting into guesswork territory. And what we're trying to achieve here is teams that are, very reliable across the program so that the business can do a good job of understanding what can be delivered, how much capacity the software organization has, whether or not we need to add teams, or whether or not we need to optimize the teams we have further. And then also, how does that affect our roadmap for the things we want to build? How do we prioritize things, knowing how much we are capable of getting done? There's one other thing that I would want to mention as a statistical category that you would have seen on that initial dashboard, and that's spread measurements. And although they don't tell you something specifically about teams, they do tell you something about the program. And they look a bit like this. What we have here is a number that basically tells us how different the teams are from each other. And this is kind of based on standard deviation. That's how I like to calculate it. And what we want to understand here is, what should our strategy and tactics be for approaching improving our program's reliability and efficiency? Are we looking at a couple of teams that are struggling and are outliers and they're changing our numbers, but for the most part, most teams are doing really well? Or if we have a tighter spread, are we really looking at something that is happening across the entire program, i.e. a particular practice of a discipline that might not be working out for anybody, and maybe we want to get in and do a whole of program approach. So these numbers help us understand, should we be diving into individual team statistics more and taking a look at which teams are struggling with specific things, or whether we want to look at everything that's happening and maybe think about how we are practicing each of our disciplines across the whole program. So this gives us some ideas about where we want to put our attention with the people we have in our lab who are practice leads or coaches, and where they can do the most good. So when you put it all together, you have that concise program dashboard. It's something that you can easily put on a screen or share a link around, and it becomes a really good communication tool for interfacing between the business and the software studio. And for people who are leading those software organizations, this is a great tool for helping explain exactly what does the program health look like, what does it need right now, how does that map to a roadmap of features or pieces of value that the business wants to create. Do we need more people? Do we have enough people, but we want to do a bit of work to get more out of the program that we have? It creates a common language that is compatible with the way that most businesses think about utilizing a resource. The other thing about it, of course, is, as we mentioned before, it's visually very easy to understand. If you look at it and there's just a bunch of green on it, then don't mess around with it. Manage by exception. Look where the problems are, yellows and reds, and focus on those things. One thing I want to mention here is benchmarking before I pass the baton back to Krista. When coming in and starting this kind of work, it's probably a good idea to set benchmarks that are fairly easily achievable at the outset so that you don't damage team morale and basically come to everybody and say, everything's broken. But over time, what you can do when you start to hit a lot of greens is tighten up some of these numbers, right? And then you might be pushing some teams into yellow, maybe a couple of teams there even into red. But that gives you the opportunity to sort of incrementally improve your program until you get to a point where you feel like, every time you tweak those numbers, everything just goes red and you really kind of hit the optimized state. And then you have a dashboard that works with a set of highly optimized teams to let you know if anything slides. That's pretty much how I've utilized this in the past. And, I recommend not going in too hard with teams at the beginning and making sure that you do give people the opportunity to improve quickly, turn those indicators green, and, really, really kind of boost the morale in the sense that, there is ways for teams to get better and that they can feel good about it. All right, I'm going to hand back over now to Krista so that she can talk about some practical application of the things we've been talking about.
Okay, so we have mapped out where to go from here so that you and your teams can start on your journey. The best time to start measuring is at the start, but that shouldn't discourage you if you've missed that mark and your program is already established. These metrics will drive productivity, which is valuable at any life cycle, and will still encourage a common language. Two things to consider when starting this journey is setting up a planning tool to gather this raw data and ensure that getting this data is less of a chore than meeting with multiple teams per week. A bonus will be the initial enablement work to educate and demonstrate the value of this approach and to coach leaders on how to correctly interpret these metric models. First, you'll want to set your own baseline. Let's strive for an achievable expectation for your program that will deliver a reasonable level of program health. In the near future, as teams are able to identify the opportunity areas and course correct, the team can raise their boundaries. More teams will stay green and less involvement is needed. The ideal state has your teams within your program nearly all green and optimal health has been reached. Because we are human, perfection is a little tricky, but by continuously monitoring the teams, your corrections can be made more immediately. Especially in the early phases of the program, there is a lot of value in pursuing some of those traditional qualitative approaches. We need to learn the local culture and operational model so that we can develop an initial playbook for both manage by exception tactics and for encouraging and enable an impactful local community of practice. The beginning phases of the approach is to get your teams familiar with why and how to gather these behavior metrics. We aim to have the teams understand how these measurements are going to help them and improve their velocity. Next, when these teams are more familiar with their metrics, they should be empowered to make corrections or ask for specific help as needed. And then finally, as most teams in the program have gone green, there is much less effort diagnosing and correcting team issues, allowing for program coaches and programs to grow at a higher rate. So thank you so much. This portion of the talk is over and we're so excited we can move over to the question and answer portion. So please join us for any questions or comments that you may have.
Well, as mentioned, if you have any questions or you want to ask anything in addition, if you go to the Slack channel for this talk, which is Session Team Operation Metrics for Optimization, you'll see a link to the Q&A that you can go to, and you'll get a chance to ask any other things that you have. Well, I enjoyed that talk quite a bit, and seeing the other talks. There's a lot more talks coming up, and you'll see another person hosting the talks, my good friend Rita. But it's been enjoyable, and have a short break here, and then come back for a talk with 5 people in it, which I think is going to be exciting to watch.